It's the Happy Families Podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
I'm really excited about a special edition of the Happy Families Podcast today. My guest is a high-profile New York Times best-selling author. You might have heard of her. She has a very, very popular podcast as well. I'm going to do the whole intro. Dr. Lisa Damour, the author of three New York Times bestsellers. The first one, all about teenage girls, called Untangled. The second one, also about teenage girls, called Under Pressure. And her third, brand new book. It's called The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. I have my dog-eared copy with underlining and highlighting all through it right here. She hosts the Ask Lisa podcast, which is, I think, the only parenting podcast that I listen to because diminishing returns, right? You can only listen to so much parenting, and there are very few people who are going to say stuff that's really worth grabbing onto. But this is the one that I listen to outside of my own. Works in collaboration with UNICEF and is recognized as a thought leader by the American Psychological Association. Dr. Damour is also a regular contributor to the New York Times and CBS News. And I'm just delighted to have Lisa joining me on the Happy Families Podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to hear that mine is the podcast you listen to.
Yeah, it is. And I'm not going to make a big deal about it, but it's just a thrill to have you here. Lisa, a couple of personal things about you. You're based in the United States. You have kids. Why don't you tell people a bit about your family so that they know that you don't just have the clinical knowledge and have written the books. You've actually got the on-the-ground experience, right?
I'm based in Shaker Heights, Ohio, so in the American Midwest. And I have two daughters, one who is 19, who just finished her first year of college, and one who is 12, who's going into seventh grade. So I'm on either ends of adolescence, and I also parented teenagers and young kid through the pandemic, and I think that was a very unique experience for all of us.
Yeah, thank you for that. As you know, I have 6 daughters. My eldest has just recently announced that she and her husband are expecting our first grandchild. So
congratulations. That's a big deal.
It's kind of crazy. I'm officially old enough to be a grandpa.
There you go.
Well, I was going to say I don't know quite how that happened, but I do. But we don't need to talk about that today.
Yeah.
All right. So today's conversation is a little bit different. So formatically on the Happy Families podcast, we normally only talk for maybe 15 or so minutes. But having you here, it's just too good an opportunity. And I want this conversation to take as long as it needs to talk about the emotional lives of teenagers. And I want to ask you a question that is a little bit of a provocation right out of the gate. And that is, do we make too much of a big deal about emotions? Now, I say that as somebody who teaches parents how to emotion coach, and I'm all about recognizing our children's emotional world. I recognize the science behind just the incredible value of it. And I've watched it happen in my own family. When I make a big deal about my kids' emotions, it's valuable. But the more I'm watching trends in parenting at the moment, the more I'm becoming concerned that we're elevating the importance of emotions too much in our efforts to support our children and our teens. Has the pendulum swung too far, Lisa?
Perhaps. I will tell you what your question reminds me of. It reminds me of a conversation I had literally almost 20 years ago when I was enormously pregnant with the kid who just finished her first year of college, my oldest daughter. And so I was about to become a parent for the first time. And I was with a senior clinical colleague, and we were wrapping up a meeting. And it was the last time I was going to see her before I went on maternity leave. And I was almost out the door. And she was like, Lisa, do you want me to tell you how psychologists mess up their kids? And I said, yes. And she said, they talk about feelings too much. They talk about them too much, that when the kid is having an upset feeling, the psychologist parent might be saying, oh, you're having a mad feeling. Let's explore that mad feeling. And what she said is there comes a point where you say, you've been upset for a while. What's going to help you feel better? And I think that line of hers, which is sort of a throwaway line, really encapsulates what we want to do, is to both validate and acknowledge and take seriously kids' emotions. But if talking about feelings isn't giving relief, if they're not getting better by just getting some expression, to quickly change gears, and this is really something, I lay out in the book, to move towards well, then how do we tame that emotion? What's going to help you feel better? Being one of the ways that we can start to ask that question. So I think the way my colleague just guided me, and it was such great advice, and I so appreciated it, on the way out of this meeting, has obviously stayed with me for a very long time.
When you hear that, what do you think's going on for an adolescent? What do you think's going on in their mind?
Well, I think it happens, right? That we say that we want our kids to talk with us about their feelings, and then when we do, we don't always know what to do with that moment. And I will tell you, my go-to response, both as a parent and also the one I recommend, is just start with empathy. It's a very small step, but I think probably the words I say more than anything after about 9 p.m. in our house is like, oh man, that stinks, when they tell me what's wrong. And my goal is to see is like, is that going to get it, right? Is that as much as you needed, which is that you told me about the upset feeling and I said, I hear that stinks, or I'm so sorry that happened to you. And then I take a beat because sometimes they're like, yup, I thought so too. And then they're ready to move on, or they may deepen it and want to talk more about it. But I think offering empathy is a first response, and offering it with the confidence that that may be all that is required in the moment does a huge amount of work of both staying present, but also being a steady presence, right? We're not getting agitated ourselves. We're not canceling plans. We're not picking up the phone. We're just saying, empathy may be what you're looking for here, so I've got plenty of that.
I have 2 comments on this. Number one, I'm amazed that you're even talking after 9 p.m. Because for me, I've got nothing at all. But secondly, what I love about that, oh man, that stinks, that line is you're not trying to fix the problem, but you're also not going too deep into the emotional world of your teenager. It's just this surface level, maybe it's an empathic response, but the invitation is then at their feet to decide what they're going to do with it.
Do you want to go deeper, or is that enough?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And it's a very, it's also how much energy I have at 9 p.m.
Right. Okay.
I can do that.
I rest my case.
Yes.
So Lisa, I see 2 common, but well-intentioned mistakes that parents make when it comes to their teens and their emotions. The first mistake we've already talked about. That's we sometimes make too big of a deal about emotions. In fact, just on that, we've had a TV show in the last month or so here in Australia called Parental Guidance. I'm the co-host and expert on the show, and we've had some gentle parents who are on the show this time. We get a whole bunch of parenting styles. A whole bunch of parents in the room. We get all the parents to do these challenges with their families. We watch the challenges back, and each parenting style comments on what they're seeing, what they like, what they don't like about the other parenting styles. It's fascinating conversations that come out of it. And one of the biggest criticisms of the gentle parent was you make too big of a deal about your kid's emotional state. Like sometimes you've just got to get onto it. And so this conversation, we've already covered that off, but I wanted to highlight just how prescient that issue is right now. But the second one that I see a lot of parents try to step into is that a lot of parents try to shield their children from emotional pain because they don't want their kids to be traumatized. Now, there are 2 questions that come out of this observation. The first is, I would love it if you could talk about the idea of trauma and children and teens experiencing trauma, because my sense is that the definition of trauma has expanded over the last decade or so. But also, if we could talk a bit about why shielding kids from emotions might be counterproductive.
Just to start with the first part about over focus on emotion, under focus on emotion, like where does it really belong? One of the metaphors I share in the book, I learned from a dear colleague of mine here in town, another psychologist, her name is Terry, and I cite her in the back of the book. And she has this great metaphor, and I think this gets to sort of the gentle parenting question, which is, she says, emotions, they should be one member of our personal board of directors. That we all have like an internal board of directors, and there's many people at that table, and it's like, or many, figures at that table. So it's like our obligations, our interests, our logistical concerns, financial concerns, there's all of these things that help with decision making. And emotions are on the board, that they do have value in helping us know how things are going or how we feel, whether something's working or not working. But the kicker, the way that Terry says it is, emotions are on the board. They do not chair the board, and they almost never have the deciding vote. And I think that way of thinking about it, that emotions are enormously valuable in balance with other considerations, but they don't call the shots. Very rarely do they call the shots, I think is a helpful way to approach it. Then there's the issue of trauma. And I would say, Justin, like to put it quite directly, I do think parents worry that very, very intense emotions will harm their child. And I can tell you, as the mother of adolescents, I see where parents get that concern. when a teenager is having a very, very powerful emotion, it is harrowing to watch. It is harrowing to be, present for. And I really have a deep empathy for parents' sense that this may be damaging my child for them to be as upset as they are. I really get that. Now, the very good news is that is rarely the case. That humans, we are built to withstand a great deal of emotion. Teenagers, by their nature, have very intense emotions. And typically developing teenagers will have a deeply intense upset emotion, followed not too long after by a perfectly happy emotion, right? There's sort of a rapid sequence. So then it gets to the question of, can emotions harm our kids? And the answer to that is yes, if they are traumatic, which then gets to your question of, well, what makes something traumatic? And certainly you're right, in the US, the general discourse around trauma has really broadened the use of the term. The way we think about it clinically, technically, as psychologists has never changed, but the culture uses the term in a very, very broad way. So if we go to the definition that we rely on as clinicians, a trauma is an experience that outmatches a person's ability to cope with the experience. And the metaphor I use in my book is, it's the difference between a surge of water that tests a dam and a surge of water that breaks a dam, right? If coping is the dam and, water are the emotions, we do not want people overwhelmed. Now, here's the really precise and important and maybe nitpicky but critical issue. And you know this, but just to explain to your listeners, we don't actually refer to events as traumatic. We refer to impact as traumatic, because the same event could traumatize one person but not another. And we know this, right, from years of studying soldiers, that we're all in the same battalion. They all went through the same horrors. Some come back and they're totally traumatized and others are just deeply upset, right? And so it's really an interaction between the event, to whom the event occurs, the, various factors involved with the person who experiences the bad event. Now, that said, important asterisk, there's some things that people go through that are just so bad we call them traumas because they're almost certainly going to traumatize anybody, right? I mean, so, horrors of war and, obviously terrible assaults, things like that. But the question of trauma usually comes down to, is the person able to cope with what happened? And if the answer is no, then they stand to be traumatized. And if a person is traumatized, it leaves a mark. It is definitely bad for kids. It's bad for anybody to be traumatized. But when you get into the subtleties of it, it's not always so cut and dried. What's a trauma or what's not going to be a trauma for any given person?
I love the dam bursting. Are my resources sufficient to cope with the demands of the moment? That's such a beautiful illustration of that. It's terribly reductionist of me to say it, but the word that I'll usually use when I'm describing trauma is a result of processing. If we've got the capacity to process and respond in healthy and adaptive ways, then even the most quote-unquote traumatic things can be minimally impactful. And that's your word again, the quality of the impact, which for me comes back to a processing issue. We still haven't dealt with the underplaying of emotions, but I just want to stay with this trauma concept for a minute. When our children experience something that we perceive could be traumatic because of their huge emotional response, because of the quality they're processing right now, the impact that it seems to have seems overwhelming. Mm-hmm. Outside of empathy, which we've obviously covered off quite comprehensively already, what other tools do parents have to support their children so that their kids can respond adaptively and process effectively?
What that brings us to is the giant, gorgeous body of work on emotion regulation.
I love this.
That we're talking about kids having really big, powerful feelings, and those are unavoidable. Those are often valuable for growth and development, but they do need to be regulated. And as you know, nearly half of my book, the chapters 4 and 5, there's only 5 chapters, is devoted to very specific strategies to help kids regulate. And it's in two buckets. Chapter 4 is sometimes kids regulate emotions through expressing them, talking about them, getting them out physically, weeping, listening to music that catalyzes the experience. And sometimes kids regulate emotions by taming them, by finding ways to quiet them. So seeking comforts, temporary distractions, problem solving, gaining a new perspective, taking advice, like there's that sort of in that group of regulatory strategies. And so the job of an adult is two things. One is watch what your kid does. I think so often we're like in there trying to intervene and the kid is like, I'm going to go cuddle with the dog and watch my show, right? The kid is already well underway with perfectly gorgeous coping. And if, and only if, your kid cannot figure out a way to express feelings that brings relief and or a way to tame feelings that brings relief, then you get in on it. Maybe get them talking if you think they need to do that. Maybe offer them comforts if you think that would actually help take the emotion down a few notches. But to see ourselves in that auxiliary role of supporting what truly kids do quite naturally. And I think often, and I think this was very much an effect of writing this book, I think often we don't appreciate enough how good kids are at regulating their own emotions, because sometimes they use strategies that strike us as quirky or we just don't appreciate them, like, going outside to, run around and play sports and blow off steam. Like, that's an emotion regulatory strategy for a lot of kids. It's a good one, but we don't always see it for what it is.
Let's say we go back to that first example that you used. You've got a child who's had a big emotion. Maybe they have experienced something that's quite traumatic, and now they're sitting in front of the television eating ice cream under the blanket and petting the dog, like you suggested. For me, I would see my child doing that, and I would be concerned. Hang on, this is not adaptive. This is you're not actually dealing with it. You're distracting yourself. You're not there at all. Now, I know the value of distraction. In my mind, logically, I get that sometimes you just need a day or two or a week or two to adapt to the new reality. Your friends have been bullying you. You've lost your friendship group. You've dumped your boyfriend or your girlfriend, or they dumped you. Some big emotional upheaval has happened, and you kind of do need to just hide under the blankets and hibernate. And yet, on about day 2 or day 3, you know that even though you know that this is necessary and mourning and grief are part of the emotional repertoire and experience of kids, you know that you're going to be banging on that door and saying, you need to get up. You need to get on with things. Like this process of leaving it to them, but feeling a need to interfere. It's a reality of parenting, right? And we just want the best for our kids. Our intentions are good. Where do we draw that line?
Let's say it wasn't traumatic, but it was very upsetting. Because obviously, if a kid's been traumatized, we're going to go down a different path in terms of intervention, but just very upsetting. The goal of good coping is that it brings relief and does no harm. That's the definition of what constitutes good coping. And so it's well within the realm of possibility that a kid could use distraction for coping and get relief, but start to use so much distraction, day after day, binge watching TV or day after day playing on video games to try to suppress emotions, that it starts to cause harm, meaning they're not doing the other things they're supposed to be doing, or they're not getting enough sleep, or they're now becoming, they're not physically active, or it's damaging their good relationships. And so I think that is, if we work within that idea of like, if it's bringing relief and doing no harm, it's fine. And I tell a story in this book about my older daughter, with her permission, at the height of her stress about the college process, she had a can of seltzer and it was closed and she was shaking it. And I was like, what are you doing? She's like, I'm so stressed about the college process. I'm going to go spray this all over the backyard. Okay. Super weird, brings relief, does no harm. Fine. Like we can sacrifice one can of seltzer to the college process. So what I've come to really think about, and again, like it's so useful. And I know you have this experience too. Like when you write a book, like you really have to sort out a new way of thinking about things, especially around distraction. The issue with distraction is not in and of itself distraction. Distraction can actually be very valuable. It's dosing, right? That you can't distract so much that you create a new set of problems. And so my own conversations clinically with teenagers are much, much better now that I'm like, yeah, distract yourself, fine. Like video games, fine. It's not the distraction, it's the dosing. That conversation goes well because they're like, yes, I'm not doing my homework because of the distraction. I'm like, all right, you need to fix the dosing. Like you can still play video games, but not so much.
I love the simplicity of that. It's just so reassuring to hear. Now let's step back into that last part of that question that we kind of moved away from. Shielding emotions, shielding our kids from their big emotions. Can we talk about why that's counterproductive? And are there any times when it actually would be useful?
So the useful time is if you think there's a chance they could become traumatized, right? I think that's the line. Like, we don't let kids become traumatized if we can help it. And so if you know that it's just going to overwhelm a kid. And it's interesting, like, even you can picture, like, kids looking at horror movies, right? That could be traumatizing for some kids. Or kids watching pornography can be traumatizing for them. Like, that they just are unable to cope and then they really are suffering as a result. So we shield kids from those kinds of things. There is, however, and this is, I think, the hardest thing to come to terms with as a parent, there's such value in our kids experiencing distress. And I think the reason it's so hard as a parent is that we are programmed to not want to see our kids in pain, right? I mean, when your kid is in pain, like, you just, everything in you as a parent wants to make it stop. And even, like, anytime my daughters have had, like, colds, right, or flus, I have thought, like, I would give anything that I could have the symptoms and not watch them have the symptoms. Like, I would so much rather be sick than witness them being sick, And so I think when our kid's in pain, like, every, like, cell in our parenting body is like, well, what can I do? What can I do to stop this? Okay, but here's why we don't want to. Number one, it's a waste of your energy. Your kid's going to be in pain. So, like, save your energy for helping them through it. Like, you can't get around this. Number two, it helps them grow. That when kids are in pain, either because, maybe they had a bad breakup, and so they have to, like, really figure out how to get past that, who they can draw on for support, like, making sense of that relationship for themselves, figuring that out. Like, it's miserable to watch, but it's a huge growth experience to come through something like that. Or they learn not to do something that they shouldn't have done that caused so much pain, right? I mean, just, I think about a 15-year-old boy I had in my practice who cheated and got caught, and it was bad, and he was in big trouble, and he got stuck with me, and it was not good. And I remember him saying, like, this is really making me think about the kind of person I want to be. And you don't get there through easy experiences. So it's hard to watch our kids in pain, and yet there's real value. And it also, this is the other thing, it's where empathy comes from. I mean, that experience of, like, being willing to face and accept one's own distress, I think, is actually the basis of being able to tolerate and accept other people's distress.
I've been talking with Dr. Lisa Damour. She is the author of The Emotional Lives of Teenagers, a brand new best-selling book on the New York Times list, all about, well, the emotional lives of our teenagers. Because I had so much fun talking with Lisa and the conversation went so long, we're going to bring you part 2 of this discussion next Wednesday. Can't wait to share it with you as we talk about a whole lot of other things, like why are boys doing such harmful things, especially not just to themselves, but also to the girls around them, and what does shame do as an emotion to our teens. That's all coming up next week as we continue our conversation with Dr. Lisa Damour, the author of The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. And if you'd like more about making your family happier, please visit us at happyfamilies.com.au and become a member today. When you become a member, you support the work that we're doing and help us to reach more families to make a bigger difference in their lives.